confused, Ed, because you said it's not toxic to mammals. So why are they winning the class action suits?
Good question. Not toxic to mammals. We're all mammals. The problem is, we're not just mammals. We have a gut microbiome that's being severely impacted. The bacteria, essential bacteria for our health, is located in our intestines. And as we take in glyphosate, small amounts, 3 meals a day, it's going through our digestive system and impacting those. We have epidemics in this country going on. All right? Now, I haven't focused this on humans so much. I do give a workshop on that. But we have epidemics going on in this country that are new. You know, who ever heard of a gluten intolerance when I was young? Nobody. I read articles, not research, but I read articles that say it's not the gluten, it's the glyphosate. So I'm desperate for research.
Yeah.
But it's not going to happen on our government's level with the agencies we have now. Shep?
Very quickly, I'm aware, having been involved in PCB remediation in the Houstonic River issues and such things.
Me too, yeah.
You too, I'm sure. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, with the exception of very well-financed research, it was infeasible financially to test for the appearance of contaminants of one sort or another, because to get test results down to the fine level of parts per billion was nigh unto impossible. And so test results would come back 15, 20 years ago as non-detect, because the equipment and the technology being employed simply wasn't able to detect it. And non-detect was taken to mean not there.
Right.
I don't know when it happened, but there was a threshold that was reached 10 or 15 years ago, and all of a sudden, parts per billion, which is 1,000 times more sensitive, 1,000 times more precise,
Right.
Parts per billion became the standard, and you will see, we see things now in terms of acceptable levels, if there is such a thing, expressed in parts per billion now, which it never was before. Because of this, is a lot of this information that's now available about glyphosates being based on parts per billion of being found in food and in plants and animals and whatever. Are we getting more information about glyphosate contamination because now the testing technology can see it, whereas 15, 20, 30 years ago, they couldn't see it?
Right. No, that's true. The testing, they're talking in terms of parts per trillion.
Really?
Yeah. There's good research that parts per trillion of glyphosate. Now, this is in vitro, in glass, not in we don't test in humans. I don't know anybody that wants to be tested like that. But in vitro, they're talking in terms of 1 part per trillion actually stimulates the growth of breast cancer cells. Parts per trillion. So there's good research out on that. Please go home and Google some of this information. And you Google the research. You don't Google an article. This research is peer reviewed, it's published, it's independent. You see, in order to get something published in a scientific journal, you have to have it peer reviewed by a certain number of scientists that look at this research and determine whether it's valid or not. That's what I want you to look at. That's what I've given Shep some information for you guys to have. And I'm just skimming over and look at the abstracts. Don't try to read the whole thing. People are, I like doing it, but nobody else does.
Ed, let me ask you a couple questions.
Okay.
If an objective of ours is to control invasives, whether it's a larger scale or smaller scale, are the alternatives to glyphosate, whether it's organics, vinegar-based, whatever it might be, as effective as glyphosate?
One thing about glyphosate, this is easy. I don't know if you remember
Well,
that in the
the other
first slide.
question I have is with regard to application.
Okay.
Spraying is easy, it creates more risk. Dabbing a plant is easy and maybe limits, which is a question, the risk of glyphosate. So if you could address those two issues, alternatives, effective or no, and application, safer or not.
You know, it all depends. Okay. As far as application, spraying can be very difficult. I mean, it depends on the weather conditions. Humidity, wind, you know, rain.
I understand. So if we had a landscaper come in here and say, yes, I will clear these invasives or control them, we will not spray, but we'll cut and we'll dab the plant. Is that a relatively safe or not safe application for glyphosate?
If we're talking about safe to the environment, when he dabs it, like cutting off a vine, dabbing it, going down, that glyphosate is going to be translocated down to the roots of that vine. When it decomposes, it's going to be deep into the soil and have the impacts that we talked about.
So even dabbing is dangerous.
It's all dangerous. This is a dangerous chemical. Now, which is better? Spraying or painting or dabbing, whatever? Well, I think the dabbing is better.
But
You
it's
know,
still dangerous.
it's safe. But I'm glad that I don't have to make a living doing that. Because I'm also concerned about who's doing the dabbing. The human that's doing that.
Let's just assume we have qualified, licensed people know what they're doing. Is dabbing as effective with a non-glyphosate agent?
With some plants it can be. Woody plants generally. Of course you wouldn't do it with herbaceous plants. You know, and just and so like, you know, glossy buckthorn, for instance. Personally, I'd rather see us girdle them.
Okay.
You know, you're going to cut them anyway. You're going to cut them and then dab the exposed stem with glyphosate. But why not just girdle them with a chainsaw? Instead of making one cut, make 3 band cuts. You know, a glossy buckthorn, for instance, a good sized one might be this big, might be 3-4 inches in diameter. It's not a big tree. It's more of a shrub.
So then it becomes a cost issue.
This is what you always hear, cost issues. It's cost effective to use glyphosate. It's not cost effective to use other things. What I say is it's very costly to poison soil.
No, I agree.
In the long run.
I agree.
Yeah, that's my argument for it.
Okay.
You know, I know you're not saying that, but,
No,
Yeah.
I think.
but you know, we think, well, this is gonna cost too much if we girdle them. Instead of taking one cut and then taking out and painting the cut, we'd have to make 3 little cuts around to prevent the vascular system from transporting nutrients and water up and down the stem. That's not going to take too much longer, and in the long run,
Safer.
it's a much safer thing to do for the individuals doing it, the environment, the community.
Anybody
It might
else?
be small amounts, but we're also thinking in terms of cumulative effects. You know, this person here does it, and that person, and all of a sudden, we've got a large cumulative effect.
As far as banning glyphosate, you're saying that the Home Rule Act doesn't work in Massachusetts anymore.
Not for that.
Not for that.
Yeah, we
So
do
the
have
state
some
has
things.
control. Are there any towns that are trying to push this through?
There's several towns that have banned glyphosate on town-owned property. That we can do. But to make a wide ban, a blanket ban within a community, you can't. Oh, there's only one community that I know of. Warner,
I think Warwick.
what's the name of it?
Warwick?
Warwick.
Yeah.
Warwick has banned it. And I talked to one of the selectmen at the hearing in Boston last week, and they've done it, and there's peer pressure associated with it, but there's no enforcement with it. But you know what? There's no enforcement on the state level either. I had a neighbor that got sprayed by a commercial company with drift, put her in the emergency ward, kept her out of her house for 2 weeks, called the state. The state came out to test to see if it drifted over to her property. She knew it did. They came out 2 weeks later, after it rained twice, and they couldn't find anything. That was right down the street from where you used to live, Lisa. Yeah. And those fields that are down there. You see, essentially, we don't have any enforcement in this state either that does this, you know, so.
Where is glyphosate banned? Where is glyphosate banned as far as Europe, California?
You know, I don't have that memory in the state. Only on state-owned, not state-owned, but town-owned properties. That can be allowed.
But it's banned in Europe and California?
Different places all throughout the United States, but mostly municipalities. And there's a good chart, a good reference on the computer that lists all of those.
Let me get to people in the audience because,
Hang on, Jeff, I just have two quick ones. You mentioned that the AMPA is toxic, that's toxic to mammals,
Yes.
the degraded form is toxic to humans. And then is there an idea of the half-life on the AMPA? You mentioned it's long-term, but,
Half-lives for all of these depends on what substrate they're part of.
yeah, I got
In water, it's slower.
Yeah.
In hydric soils, we mentioned that that microorganisms break it down. Well, in hydric soils that are saturated, our microbe populations are low, and they're populations that are anaerobic and are really not decomposers that way. You know, you're better off having. So in wetland soils, I would expect them to last longer. Is the research out there? I can't find it. I would love to know. I'd love to give you hard data on all of this. It's not being done.
And it's been, I guess the second part would be, it's been used since the mid-60s as a herbicide? I mean, once it was used as a
Since the
descaling.
70s.
70s.
As an
And
herbicide.
the EPA has called it clean since then. It's been considered clean since then from the E EPA.
Well, it's been minor, it was minorly used
Yeah.
at that time. What's really, there's about 280 million pounds distributed in this country every year. 280 million pounds of it. And what's really increased the use of it are genetically engineered crops, which are dependent on glyphosate. You know, farmers can go out, plant so many acres of corn, the corn comes up, the weeds come up, they go and spray that corn. The corn doesn't die because it's genetically engineered to withstand the effects of glyphosate, but the weeds do. All you have to do to see this next spring is go past the dairy and Lee there, right on Route 7. High Lawn. I could tell you some stories. I don't want to badmouth High Lawn. Just take a look as you go by there in the spring. You'll see the corn coming up. You'll see the weeds in between the rows. The weeds will be brown. The corn will be green. And those fields have been glyphosated.
Just to quickly, if you just Google where is glyphosate banned, the list is enormous. Austria, Bahrain, Belgium, Bermuda, Brazil. It's incredible.
And you know what? There's a
And that's,
whole,
I mean, we're gonna go through the alphabet, that's where it's banned.
Bobby, there's a whole section on just the United States. You know,
Yeah.
where it's banned. It's a
Yeah.
long list. This is something that people are starting to really take a look at.
okay. It's 7:35, and I know you're all here because you're interested in this, so our agenda can wait a little while. But I'd like to do this in somewhat of an organized way.
I'd like to get Jess.
Yeah.
She needs to go home.
Jess, you might want to introduce yourself, or-
Well,
but if you have any questions or comments, about this Jess Toro, who does invasive management,
Yeah,
and her partner,
Sarah's here. But I'm actually on the agenda
For,
for McAllister.
McAllister, but you
And
wanna?
that's what I need to, Shep had told me I'd probably be on around 7:45. I've just gotta get back to my daughter.
All right, well, we can pause this for a moment and
Is that
take that up.
okay for me
Yeah.
to do a McAllister
Yes,
update? So I
okay.
can.
All right, so let's relax for a moment, Ed. We're gonna take up an update on the McAllister Wildlife Refuge project submissions to the CPC for next round of